The people were amazed at him. They say, where did he get these miraculous powers? But also, where did he get this wisdom, this skill? They weren't just amazed at the miracles. They were amazed, I would say, at his logic. It's very interesting that though we live in a Jesus-haunted culture, Jesus still has moral authority in the culture. PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, ran a campaign. Jesus was a vegetarian. And the chief marketing officer for PETA said this was their most successful campaign ever. Why? Because Jesus is a moral authority still. And that's something we can use as a bridge to talk to people. Notice what doesn't come up on this. Was Jesus a wise person? People search for other things, but I want us to return to looking at Jesus as a wise person. In fact, he is wisdom in person. God is wisdom, and Jesus is wisdom in person. Now, was Jesus a wise man? Many of us will say yes. How do we talk about it, explain it, make it real to people that we know in our schools, in our workplaces? It's interesting, a number of years ago, Denver Seminary professor Douglas Gruteis wrote a book on Jesus in a series of about other philosophers. And they included Jesus in that series. And he asked the question, was Jesus, whatever he may have been, and Gruteis is a Christian philosopher, so he believes that Jesus is more than a philosopher. But he said, is he a bona fide philosopher? And should we treat him that way? A lover of wisdom. In fact, wisdom in person. In that book, Gruteis argues a resounding yes to the fact that Jesus is a wise person. But he makes it very, very practical. And in my philosophy classes, both to Christian and non-Christians, I try to make this very practical as well. In fact, you can take passages like Luke 13, talking about the disputation of the Sabbath, and you can put Jesus' dialogue there into, he uses this very specific argument form called a fortiori. And if we had time, we could go through the argument form, and you can see just how skilled Jesus is as a logician. Further, take the famous passage about paying taxes to Caesar. In that passage, you're probably familiar with it, but Jesus uses a logical technique called enthymeme. And an enthymeme is an argument that leaves out the conclusion. And so what does Jesus say? Do you recall? They ask him about paying taxes, and he says, whose image is on the coin? And they say Caesar's. He says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, right? Then he says, give to God what is God's. And then mic drop, he's done. But what's the implication? Where do people go? What's the idea there is that the conclusion is, well, what's God's? Whose image is on you? Well, God's image. Well, then give to God what is God's. And people can decide to accept it, or they can decide to reject it. In fact, if you look at other passages, they say that the people were amazed at him. They say, where did he get these miraculous powers? But also, where did he get this wisdom, this skill? They weren't just amazed at the miracles. They were amazed, I would say, at his logic, his skill in reasoning, his care for people in the midst of that, to not demean them, but to dignify the mind that God gave them. Boy, if I had time, I'd love to take you on a journey talking about Jesus' metaphysic, his epistemology, his entire ethic is something I teach at the university. But what I find time and time again is you can find wisdom in Jesus, but you got to be willing to make the journey. God is wisdom. He's revealed in creation, in his commands, and specifically in the person of Christ.